Okay, thank you for coming back. In this next session, we'll be taking a look at some of the challenges that emerging craft brewers are facing as they look to take their business from the local level and increase their distribution and their production capabilities. To my left, we have Andy Thomas, who is the CEO of the Craft Brewers Alliance, which has Widmer, Red Hook, Kona, Omission, Square Mile. Did I forget anything?
You got it right.
And then to his left is a familiar face, Chris Fernari. He is the editor of Brewbound, and he'll be kind of chiming in along with Andy. And my name's Dave. I'm a reporter with Brewbound, and I'll be conducting this conversation. All right.
Let's give it up for Dave, everybody. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I guess to start, we'll start with you, Andy. What are some of the typical challenges that facing small brewers, and how do these challenges change as production grows or as you grow your distribution footprint?
So before I get started, if everybody could raise their glass, and a shout out to our host over here, Scott Lawrence. Cheers. Scott said we're all very friendly, even though we're competitive, and that's true. And I love to tell him and their brewmaster, Ben Edmonds, that I love to hate them because they brew one of the most insanely aromaed IPAs out there on the market. So Scott, cheers. Thank you for hosting us tonight. So I guess in response to the question, I think it all comes down to complexity when you start to grow. And we heard a lot about it in the earlier panel, but everybody wants variety. But the ugly side of variety for a company like ours is all of a sudden variety turns into complexity. And while everybody might like the idea of 20 or 30 or 40 different brands available in 3 different sizes in 50 states around the US and different channels, that really starts to wreak havoc on an organization that was used to doing one thing. So in a word, it's kind of, there's a flip side to variety for a company that's looking to continue to grow and be able to generate enough flow to reinvest in its business and expand, and that would be complexity. So in a word, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we went out yesterday for a couple beers and we were talking about this, and I actually think Scott probably said it best on the last panel. He said, we can do all these beers and we can experiment, and it's fine. We can deal with the rotation just fine at this level, but when we get 10 times bigger, I imagine that probably won't be the case anymore. We're going to have to think about our business differently. And that's really what I think, over the next 30 minutes we're going to kind of address is what changes when you go from a draft-only brewery, let's say, to adding 22-ounce bottles, and then from there to adding 6-packs or adding cans. Obviously, there's capital outlay that needs to come into the business in order to make that happen. But the way you conduct your business changes too.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it seems like over the past 30 years for Widmer, especially, that's obviously changed.
Sure. I think to answer what changes, I mean, this is going to sound extreme, but it's everything. So you think about the journey Kurt and Rob Widmer went on, and they started brewing alt beer back in 1984, and then as the wonderful storied history of Widmer Brothers goes, they started brewing Hefeweizen, and they brewed Hefeweizen as their primary beer for years, for nearly a decade, and didn't even bottle it. And that brand continued to grow and grow and grow, and then it wasn't until the mid-90s where they started to bottle Hefeweizen. And just going from draft to bottle alone is a huge complexity. But then when you start to introduce everything else into it, irrespective of going to different geographies, I think Scott hit on a good point in the earlier panel. There's probably the capacity in the US right now. I'm a believer. If I weren't a believer, I shouldn't be here. But 40% in Portland, I believe, is probably high watermark for right now. But what we don't think about is that means that 6 out of every 10 beers bought, in the numbers you were talking about, are not craft. 6 out of 10. That still sounds like a lot of run room for me. So if you think about what it takes, forget about going to new geographies for a second. But if you think about what it takes to start to get more and more of those 6 out of 10 that aren't craft, we believe very strongly in the concept of occasion-based segmentation at CBA. So we believe that what you're drinking is a function of the occasion you're in. It's who you are, what occasion are you in, what's your need state. So we all happen to love craft beer. We're at this symposium, and our need state right now is a little bit of refreshment because it's 103 degrees up here. Because it is a brewery, as Scott reminded me.
It was 102 before we put the lights on.
So there are beers that are going to serve that. But as we think about how do you get more and more of that 6 out of 10 that aren't craft right now, that compels you to start to brew different beers and make them available in different styles and make them available in different packages. And then all of a sudden, you need a different account base. Because the draft account around the corner that you always go to isn't necessarily going to sell the cans that you want to take to the beach with you, or the cans that you want to take to the golf course with you, or isn't going to have the 22 sharer. You know, I've been in the industry now for close to 20 years, and when I grew up in the beer business, 22s were called bombers, right? 22s aren't bombers anymore, they're sharers. It's what you take to share with everybody. So to answer your question, I think one of the first challenges is to be able to understand where am I going to grow and how am I going to go from, say, 4 out of 10 beers to take some of those 6, even before I go to new markets, which adds another level of complexity I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yeah.
But then it all of a sudden becomes about packages, it becomes about different styles, it becomes about different accounts, it becomes about quality and distribution, and I mean the list goes on and on and on. So it sounds simple. You know, I spent a number of years overseas. I was very fortunate with Heineken, and I used to joke that people do China math. And they always say, if I could get 1% of the Chinese market, it would be this big, without understanding what is it going to take to get 1% of the Chinese market. So, you know, for us in craft, I think 40 is the high watermark as we know it today. I agree with Brady. I think Portland is still years ahead of a lot of other cities, a lot of which you'll go to on this West Coast tour. I think there's still a lot of run room though, but there's complexity ahead for us.
So Chris, you just cited 10% growth or whatever, and you say the China math. So is there a specific, I guess like a magic number, barrelage-wise, where breweries need to start taking on these types of new challenges?
That's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to it because I wouldn't be sitting here. No, I think there's small and then you start to get scale. So what is scale? It depends on a lot of things. It depends on how many beers you decide to brew, how many different package forms you decide to go into, and how far you choose to distribute it.
Yep.
So if you're a 50 or a 60,000 barrel brewery that is largely draft in 1 or 2 styles and distributes pretty much within a 50 or 100 mile radius of your brewery, you probably have a lot of scale. If you are a 50,000 barrel brewery that is not producing 2 or 3 different styles, but you're producing 15, and you're doing draft, package, and can, and you're distributing in 32 states, and you have to ship it to 32 states and deal with 32 different sets of franchise laws and wholesalers and whatnot, you probably don't have scale. So
and you probably have worse margins.
You have definitely worse margins, I will guarantee you that. You know, but it's so, you know, it's interesting. I think CBA will do, we're publicly traded, everybody knows that. So I have to be careful what I say. But we will brew over 800,000 barrels this year. And we will do that in 5 different breweries around the US. We'll do it here in Portland, we'll do it in Seattle, up in Woodinville, we will do it in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, we'll do it in Kona, Hawaii, and we'll also do it in Memphis, Tennessee now with the new relationship we have there. So everybody looks at us and says, you're big. And then I say, well, yeah, in aggregate we are, but we brew in 5 different locations. So that 800,000 does not give us necessarily the scale of what an 800,000 barrel brewery would be if we were all those other things. So, you know, you're definitely right. I mean, I think it really starts to depend upon what you choose to do as your business strategy and where you choose to go.
Well, how many brewers in the audience here are 5,000 barrels or less right now? Show of hands. And in the next 5 years, would you guys more than likely want to be producing more than 5,000 barrels? right? So something is going to change when they cross over. For me, I think.
Well, so
I talked to a lot of brewers,
Sure.
so it's 5,000, something changes,
Absolutely.
and then something changes again at
yeah.
15,000 or
Yeah.
50,000.
Well, so look at stats that the BI publishes, or the Beer Institute, or the Brewers Association. So about 3,000 active breweries in the U.S. now, by all accounts. If you look at those 3,000 breweries in the U.S., so this is last year's statistics, 90% of them are under 7,500 barrels. Want to know a shocking number? 70% are under 1,000 barrels. And then you start to look at where they are, and that's what's fascinating to me. We live in Beervana, you know. California, Oregon, Washington, certainly at the head. Like stats I love to quote. If you look here in Oregon, around, Chris quoted 40% of off-premise sales. We know a lot of craft goes to on-premise, right? So depending on whose numbers you read, better than 1 in 2 beers consumed in the state of Oregon are craft. You go to a state like California, about 1 in 8 are craft. California is the largest beer state in the U.S. Second largest beer state in the U.S. is Texas. 1 in 33 are craft. Third largest beer state in the U.S. is Florida. 1 in 19 beers are craft. So when you look at the aggregate, it's that classic, my head's in the freezer, my feet are in the oven, and on average I'm at 98.6. That just doesn't work. So I don't believe there's going to be a bubble, but I do believe you'll end up with a lot of hyper expansion in certain states because there's a lot of volume there to go get.
Right. But so when you're going to get that volume, there's certain complexities. The supply chain is a huge piece of it. Mm-hmm. Paying attention to margins is a huge piece of it. Clearly, when you make a jump from a certain number, like for me, I feel like that number is somewhere in 5,000 to 10,000, and maybe a few states, and then you're a different business.
Yeah.
You're not, Breakside, I can do all these different styles and we're fine dealing with the rotation. Scott said, when we get 10 times larger, I would argue that it's probably 5 times larger, or maybe even 3 times, that something's going to change.
Yeah.
I don't know. The magic number, there probably isn't a magic number.
No, I think it all depends. It depends on, like I said, how many brews do you make? How many different beer styles do you have? How many package configurations do you have? How many states do you want to be in? And, I said complexity, and that sounds like that's all encompassing, and it really is. So if you think about it, if you just brew beer in one city and you distribute most of it in on-premise, and even if you don't package, right? Scott's doing 22s here, and a lot of breweries here are doing 22s. There are a lot of draft-only breweries left in the U.S., a ton of them, literally, thousands. If you look at, once you start to introduce packaging, you all of a sudden start to worry more about beer quality.
Right.
Because you start to worry about that, number one, basically enemy of beer, which is oxygen. And then you start to worry about quality and distribution, because you want to make sure that it's stored cold and that it's, taken care of in distribution, and you start to extrapolate it out. So, if you think about, your question of, is it 5,000, is it 10,000, is it 50,000 barrels, or what is it? It really depends on what you want to be. And I'm a big believer that craft has a ton of run room. I think the paradigm shift we heard about before, and the stories about wine, those are great examples to me of what can happen to beer. I always like to talk about coffee. So 45-second tirade here. Maybe I was always destined to work in craft because I used to work for Kraft Foods back in the early 90s. And little known fact for a lot of folks, Kraft Foods owns a coffee called Maxwell House. And in 1991, the U.S. coffee market was defined by 2 brands, Maxwell House and Folgers. It was largely a commodity, it was largely price-driven, and young people weren't drinking it anymore and were drinking other beverages. Sounds like another category we all know really, really well. All of a sudden, Starbucks comes on the scene. And there's this really weird thing going on up in Washington. And literally, I wish I kept it, just back in the days of paper memos and things. Somebody within the company wrote a memo that said, this is a fad, Americans will never pay that for coffee, they will never drink coffee that tastes that bitter, we have nothing to worry about, okay? here we are. And I think beer is like that too. So I agree with all the estimates of what can happen to craft. You know, I think for everybody we have to understand, what role do you want to play, brewers, consumers, and whatnot. What role does local play? It's a whole nother conversation you and I've had before. And then, you know, Chris talked about supply chain, but a lot of people don't understand what it takes to brew beer consistently in multiple locations, first of all, right? So I'm proud as hell. I mean, I won't get into the whole kind of 30-second ad for why I love what I do, but we spend a lot of effort and expend a lot of effort and put a lot of resource in making sure that a bottle of Widmer Brothers Upheaval that's brewed in Portland or Woodinville or even out in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, tastes the same. And that we can get it to consumers close to there, you know, fresher, faster, with less variability than a lot of other folks. And we go through a lot of hoops on that, right? So you buy a bottle of Kona, something else we take a hit for a lot, turn the bottle of Kona around, very proudly, it'll say Kona Brewing Company, Kona, Hawaii, Portland, Oregon, Woodinville, Washington, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Memphis, Tennessee. And we're pretty proud of that because we want to make sure that everybody knows where their beer is coming from, and we put a lot of effort into making sure that that beer is brewed at a really high quality. So the first thing is just make sure the beer tastes the same. And as these guys know, and any of you know who brew, water, the hardness of water, the availability of it, depending on where you get your grain from, east or west, depending on what the atmosphere is like, there's a lot of variability. But for a lot of folks, if you're going to expand geographically, job one is making sure the beer tastes as good as it does everywhere. And then you get into all the complexities of distribution and wholesalers and dealing with chain retailers, and that's a whole nother level.
Right.
But job one is quality all the time.
Yep.
So to go back to some of the numbers you just cited, you said, what was it, 70% of the breweries in the country brew less than 1,000 barrels, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
you just asked the audience how many here brew less than 5,000, and we saw a lot of hands, but they all wanted to grow when you asked that follow-up. So as they're small but growing, what are some of these, as you see it, what are some of the biggest problems facing these companies?
This is an interesting debate you and I have a lot, is there's a seduction in the industry to keep doing new and new and new and new. And one of the things I believe in is, I think quality in brands, so I think there's a trifecta, right? It's all about the quality of your beer, it's all about the attractiveness of your brand, and it's all about the quality of the service that you provide. So I think you need all three things to have a long-term proposition, right? So, you know, for me, I think there's a seduction to do more different kinds of beers and not worry about your brand as much as you should. But I've said pretty openly before, I think a beer without a brand is like a person without a personality, right? Like, think about it. You know, you think on a night when you're available and you don't have to go somewhere, who do you want to hang out with? And it's all about the personality. And I think consumers are like that with brands a lot. And I think some brands have fantastic brews, but nobody remembers the brand. And then we all know brands that spend a lot of money on advertising, but you drink the beer and it's pretty non-memorable, right? And I think you need both of those things.
Well, then there's the third category of brands that don't spend a lot of money on advertising and are pretty non-memorable too.
Right. Well, I mean, that happens, right? So you go into a lot of places in Portland and you sit at the bar, and I've been known to sit at a few bars, and you know, you hear people who are visiting say, hey, what do you have that's local? And they'll have a beer, and that will help those numbers you heard go up. But that person goes back to wherever and says, I went to Portland, I had these great beers. What were they? Oh, I don't know, they were local. Well, what were the brands?
So the biggest challenge for you is going to be branding.
I think branding is pretty important in the long term for craft beer to be able to be sustainable beyond being about local draft around the corner.
Yep.
I would argue that branding is pretty critical because you want people to remember not just what they drank in terms of the taste, but you want them to say, hey man, that was an amazing experience and I want to bring that home with me. And when I walk into Safeway or when I walk into Publix on the East Coast or wherever, they're going to pull a 6-pack of that off the shelf because they want to relive that experience and have as great a beer.
I think a weaker brand can still sell, though. I mean, something that doesn't have strong branding like some of the brands out there do. For me, the biggest challenge I think breweries are going to have is just how they execute. And do they go to a new market and then hire people for that market? I mean, we see so many people expanding their markets and then they don't hire anyone.
Right.
How do you build a brand if you don't hire someone to build it for you?
So back to Dave's question, if I were going to give anybody advice on what to avoid the seduction of doing too much too quick, style-wise or whatnot, and avoid the seduction of going somewhere you can't be. Right? We all know the term house poor, right? Everybody's like, you can afford to scrape together the mortgage, and then you can't furnish it, and then you can't have the furniture you want to have, and you can't enjoy this great space that you've got. And I think there's a seduction to be house poor in craft beer and just go to a lot of markets and rely on your wholesaler to do everything for you.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of, I won't even get into that, but there's just a ton of that.
Just because the Falling Rock Tap House in Denver wants to pour your beer the week before GABF doesn't mean you should be sending beer there.
Right. Because that's beer you're not sending around the corner, which by the way is a lot more profitable for you. And you'll probably build a much stronger following. Another thing we believe very strongly is you're only as healthy as your home market is. So, we really believe that for us, we are all about Widmer Brothers in Oregon and in Portland. We're all about Red Hook in Seattle. We're all about Kona in Hawaii. And that's because you have to be from somewhere. I'm not from here. I live here now, and I love living here, right? But I'm not from here. You're not from Boston. You live there now.
Yeah.
Dave might be from Boston.
I am.
He is. He's the anomaly up here, right? There's one in every crowd. But I think brands, again, like people are the same way. You got to be from somewhere.
Yeah.
So you got to be really strong where you're from. And the kiss of death, I think, for a brand is when you go to the home market and you can't find it on tap or in a number of places.
Right.
And that, I would argue, is a good sign of a brand that's lost its way, because it was all about the easy distribution game.
Well, and it's funny you bring that up because Harpoon, they just announced their employee stock ownership. So I went back and I was watching. We had Harpoon at our business conference at the Brewbound session, the one you spoke at, and I asked this. Going back, looking at it now, it seems so stupid that I asked this question. But I asked Rich and Dan. I said, with all the competition in Massachusetts now, there's a bunch of new breweries. Right. Do you ever feel the need to go add a new market away? And like, Rich Doyle was like, well, why would I do that? He was like, why that? I thought you were going to go a different direction with that question. I thought you were going to say retrench in the market and hire more people for Boston.
Right.
And I don't know why I was thinking the same way in my line of questioning, which was, well, okay, you're getting beat up at home maybe because of some of the smaller brands. So wouldn't you just go take share somewhere else where you're not?
It's easy to think that way. I mean, it's a lot of folks are doing that now. But I believe it's better to double down, own your home market, be strong and relevant in your home market, do the right thing. Scott mentioned community, and that's important. You got to be from somewhere. You can move a lot of places, but be strong and be relevant where you're from. And I would argue that'll also give you a better return, right? So we talk a lot about gross margin now. Again, publicly traded company. So we have shareholders we have to worry about. We have to make sure we make good business decisions, not only on behalf of our shareholders, but one of the wonderful burdens I love carrying is we have 764 employees nationally now between our pubs and our breweries. And I feel an obligation to all those folks to make sure we're doing the right thing for them. So, people are reliant upon the company to reinvest, and we're public, so that's easy for me to say. But pretty much every brewery out there has investors, okay? We just so happen to have gone the publicly traded route, so we have to disclose who those investors are, and every day I get a scorecard on whether they like what I'm doing or not, called our stock price. But I'll guarantee you every owner, brewer, company out there has somebody they have to answer to. And it's either themselves when they look in the mirror, it's their uncle who they borrowed the money from, it's the private equity firm that's funding them that they're not telling anybody about. But there's something that people have to worry about, because you got to worry about the long term and how sustainable the decisions you're making are.
Yep.
And that's another important factor, I'd say, back to your question to Rich and to Dan out at Harpoon is, hey, where do you spend your next dollar? And a lot of times it's easy to spend it somewhere where there's a great knowledge of your brand, but I'd argue for you the best thing to do is spend it at home first.
So how do you then kind of balance growing that home market while at the same time extending your reach?
I think we heard a story about muling back New Belgium, right? When we went back to the East Coast, right? I think you might have told it, Scott. You know, I'm starting to date myself, but I remember when people would mule back Coors Light from the West Coast to the East Coast. True story. I know my cultural references are getting a little old, guys. I won't talk about Gilligan's Island and all that stuff, I promise. But, you know, I think when something's strong at home, it starts to get a following. And when you're fortunate to live in a market that's a destination market, people want that experience, especially when they can't have it. So you can go and advertise anywhere if you have the money. It goes back to gross margin. But when you're strong somewhere and somebody had a killer experience on that brand, with that beer in that market, and they take that back and then they find it, I think that'll probably long-term be a great return. You know, there's a...
But you're doing the exact opposite with Kona.
Not the exact opposite.
You're advertising and
Yep.
you're expanding into new markets.
We are, because we're trying to bring what people experience in Hawaii to the mainland. And
without them having to mule it back.
Without them having to mule it back.
Right.
So, you know, on Kona, it's a good question. You know, so we're doing an advertising test on the Kona brand right now. We're testing advertising in 2 markets. And the whole campaign is around Dear Mainland. And we really believe in all the term we throw around a lot is the ethos of Hawaii. And what does Hawaii really mean to people? And what do people experience when they go to Hawaii? And we believe, and we should, that there's a really special thing that people experience when they go to Hawaii and drink a Kona in paradise. And the advertising is an attempt to let people get a little bit of a taste of that back on the mainland, and to also entice them to try to do that, and kind of remind them a little bit of, hey, we kind of get things wrong on the mainland sometimes, right? So one of our lines is, you know, happy hour is 23 hours short. You know, it's kind of, it should be the other way around. And there are things you can do with your brand as long as you're authentic and real where you are and open about it. You know, another hit we get on the Kona brand, we don't brew all the beer in Kona. No, we don't. And
so
I'll guarantee you, and I'm known to stir the pot, and somebody up here on amongst the 3 of us that you're looking at called me outspoken once, but
not Dave.
Not Dave. That person would not be him. But you know, and these are what I would call Achilles' heels of the industry. Like, look around and where's your beer come from? You know, everybody wants to know who owns you. Where does your money come from? But where does your beer come from? You know, what brewers make it? What breweries is it produced in? Are they open about it? Because one thing we experience a lot, and I think is another Achilles' heel, I would argue, for the industry, consumers don't like being fooled. So 9 out of 10 consumers will tell you, and yes, we've tested this, I get what you do, but just be open about it. And let me make the decision whether or not that makes you authentic or not. Don't hide it.
So how does all this, let's circle back. How does all this get back to people here looking for some insight into growing their business responsibly, I'd say?
Yep. I would say don't lose sight of who you are and what you got into the business for. Worry about what you can see every morning when you wake up, first and foremost, and worry about the accounts you go to every day and make sure that they continue to love you, not just because of your brand and the money that you make for them, but because of who you are and what your brand stands for. And then be really judicious about decisions you make on where to expand. So, I mean, we haven't even gotten into some of the supply chain complexities, or, you know, you think about a brand, and there are a lot of them out there, that say we're distributed in 32 states. That's great. How many people do you have in those 32 states? How often do you get out there and talk to the wholesalers in those 32 states? How often do you get out there and talk to the retailers in those 32 states? Do you really know what goes on in those places? So, be true to who you are, worry about what you can see and make sure that's always what you want it to be and you're always proud of it. And be really careful about overextending yourself. I'm really fortunate. I joke with Kurt and Rob about this. So I worked for Heineken for 12 years. And a lot of folks might know the Heineken story, but there is a Heineken family. And still to this day, Charlene Heineken is majority or one of the major owners of the Heineken brand. And I used to tell her and her husband, I carry 2 last names on my business card. I carry Heineken and I carry Thomas, and I remember that. And I say that to Kurt and Rob now too, because they're pretty opinionated still on the brand, as Brady will attest to, wherever Brady's sitting. But I always remember their names on it, right? So they take things a little bit more seriously when we come up with some harebrained idea or when we're going to do something about it. And I think that's a good discipline for us, is if you start to make the people whose name's on the bottle feel uncomfortable, you might be getting into some kind of water you shouldn't be getting into. So be true to who you are, worry about what you can see every morning when you wake up, and be really careful about where you extend yourself. I would say would be three pieces of advice I would give somebody who's looking to grow.
So beyond that, that's kind of, be true to who you are is kind of, I guess, a philosophical thing. As far as breweries that are growing, is there any, I guess, more tangible things that these companies can focus on, be it production loss, people on the street, or just anything else? Yeah,
worry about where your money goes. So, I'm a big, Scott Menon is our head of brewery operations, and I like to talk to him about beer loss or extract loss a lot. And a lot of small brewers, we heard from Scott earlier, can sell everything they can make. And for us, when we brew some pretty complex beers, all of a sudden, what you put in the tank and what comes out of the tank might only be 80% of the same volume. And when you're doing it at scale, that really starts to eat up dollars. So I worry about beer loss a lot. Worry about that.
So if Scott here at Breakside has a poor beer loss ratio,
right,
it doesn't hurt as much.
It doesn't hurt as much.
Still hurts.
It hurts because there's an opportunity cost to what he's selling, because he put 10 barrels in and he got 9 barrels out. So that's a barrel that he paid for that he couldn't sell.
Right.
Right. And and here we are in the Northwest. You guys all know, any of you who brew, hops are like sponges, right? So even if you don't want to filter in your centrifuge, you're not going to get 10 barrels out if you put 10 barrels in, right? And if you filter, it's probably a lot worse. But if you're doing it at that scale and you can sell every barrel that you got, you're in a hell of a lot better position than if you have to worry about what you make on every barrel that you actually, not only ship to a wholesaler, but that you STR. So, beer loss is a big one. Something a lot of folks don't have to deal with on a small scale, but when you start distributing outside of your home state, home market, wholesaler relations, really understanding what it takes to service a wholesaler, understanding the franchise laws in that state, understanding kind of that market and putting somebody feet on the street to support that person. All of a sudden it sounds great because there's an account 12,000 or 1,200 miles away that wants your beer. And it's great when they want it, but when it rotates off, I'll guarantee you'll get a call from somebody saying, hey, I got some inventory here that's aging, right? What are you going to do about it? And all of a sudden that's distracting.
So that's the service you're talking about?
Yeah, that's service.
But that goes back to my point of feet on the street.
Yeah, it totally goes to feet on the street. And it's interesting, Chris quoted the numbers in IRI, and I think somebody was challenging, hey, well, that's just IRI, that's just grocery. That's how advanced Oregon is now. Like, grocery and the kind of syndicated track channels, like grocery and convenience and mass, that's belly of the beast, right? That's big boy pants on. That's being able to make a headquarter call, being able to make regional calls, being able to have people who can call on the local account and program around it. An example I always give to people is national means national. So we did something with Buffalo Wild Wings last year with Red Hook. that meant they wanted Red Hook Game Changer in 942 accounts across the US. In places where we might not have sold a lot of Red Hook before, and where we couldn't necessarily sell a lot of Kona and a lot of Widmer Brothers yet, or even a lot of Omission and Square Mile.
And maybe it cost more for you to get it there.
Absolutely. So, one of the things about that is understanding, again, when you get into those accounts, what does it take to make that account happy?
So what does it take?
Service is critical. Understanding, being able to call on them, like I said, like the big boys. We have a great relationship with a little account called Safeway. And I've shared this publicly, we're the 5th largest beer supplier for Safeway now on the West Coast. CBA is, between Kona and Red Hook and Widmer Brothers. So all of a sudden, you start to say, okay, you've got to compete with what the big guys do in terms of their knowledge of all these different markets, in category management, in data, in display execution, in promotional activity. And when I go back to what I started out with, for craft to be 41% of the belly of the beast, there's a lot of the big guys that are doing a lot of heavy lifting for folks. And for the smaller brands that are really coveted to get in there, there's a ton of opportunity because a lot of people are used to drinking more bitter beers. They're used to drinking beers that might be more interesting brand-wise than a lot of what they're used to before. So that's opportunity. I totally believe that. But I said this at your conference a couple of years ago. Consumers might like small, quirky brands, but I guarantee you big retailers don't like small, quirky service.
Yeah. Well, and it's looking at some of the IRI data, you said you're 5th largest in Safeway or whatever, but
right.
If you look at IRI for Portland, there are some brands that are moving up the charts that are small, like a 10 barrel, or
totally.
a little bit bigger, like an Ninkasi, but in comparison, they're still not AB, Miller, New Belgium, Boston Beer. I mean, they're still not they're not Deschutes, they're still a little bit smaller.
Sure.
But they're still competing against them.
Yeah, they're still competing against them, and that's where I think,
So they have to be as buttoned up?
Right, so this is a great point. So somebody in Portland who's buying New Belgium isn't buying it because it's local, right? Anybody here ever buy New Belgium because it's local?
No.
Why do you buy it? Because of the brand, right? You've heard about it. Yeah. So, I think the point you're making is once you cross over into that channel, the strength of your brand becomes more critical in terms of scaling.
And how you support it.
And your ability to service the account, not only in terms of salespeople on the retail side, wholesaler execution on the wholesaler side, but your ability to make sure that when somebody cracks open that beer, it tastes good, right? Never forget that, right? Trial's easy. We might all try something one time, right? We've all been seduced to say, hey, try it. It really depends on what a great experience we have if we go back and try it when somebody doesn't force us to or dare us to do it, right? And so, yeah, I mean, that's a great provocation. Is I think a lot of brands are competing in that space, and their ability to sustainably compete there, I would argue, is about that.
And now smaller brands are also competing in a somewhat smaller way to the example that you provided with like Buffalo Wild Wings.
Right.
So, and I mentioned Golden Road earlier, but Golden Road is doing the same thing with HMS.
Right.
And they're going to be in airports all across the country, and they don't even sell beer outside of California.
Sure. So you want validation of craft being big, right? So I'll use two experiences outside of CBA to support my cause. Golden Road just sold into HMS Host in 31 different airports around the U.S. And as Chris said, nobody had ever drunk that outside of LA, but they're really friggin' strong in LA, right?
And they're new, brand new.
Brand new.
Yeah.
And another brand that just got a lot of press is that Cigar City out of Tampa just signed a deal with Carnival Cruise Lines. So now all of these people who fly to Florida and get on a cruise ship are going to be exposed to the Cigar City brand.
And Golden Road.
And Golden Road, right? So, you think of where that goes. That's why I say 6 out of the other 10, that's fair game for us, right? There's a lot of run room. But now you think about what it means for Cigar City in Tampa and for Joey and, for Golden Road and Meg. So now somebody's been exposed to their brand and they go back to Dubuque.
How do they get it?
How do they get it?
Will they get it? Will they buy it again?
Will they get it? Will the account carry it? And when they get it, will it taste good?
Yep.
Right. That's why I say
these are the questions.
Those are the questions.
Yep.
And in order to be able to answer all of those in the affirmative, it costs money. So again, I go back to don't be seduced to get outside of your comfort zone too fast. Like, build your home market. It will always be the most loyal, it will always be the most profitable, and it will always be the thing that allows you to do other things beyond that. So.
But it seems like those brands are being seduced.
I don't know if they're being seduced. I mean, consumers are going to win at the end of the day. You know, I think the consumer's always right.
I mean, that's a great deal for Meg at Golden Road.
Absolutely.
But I don't know how she's going to get beer across the country.
Is it just the volume, do you think?
Is it just the volume? I don't know that it's just the volume. I mean, I look at a lot of brands, and I drink a lot of beer, and I am very fortunate to be able to travel around and get to meet a lot of folks and talk to them. So there are brands I would tell you that I think are all about the volume, and there are brands that I would tell you are all about their brand and all about their story. And you know, the two I mentioned, I would put in the latter. Big fan of, you know, people always ask me, what's in your fridge when you can get a hold of it? That's not a CBA brand. And a Golden Road would be in my fridge.
If you could get a hold of it.
If I could get a hold of it. A Cigar City would be in my fridge if I could get a hold of it.
This is the problem. This is the problem that so many brewers are going to face.
Totally.
They told me today, I was talking to Joe from Cigar City, and he said that 93% of their beer is sold in Florida.
Yeah.
And they had to allocate
Right.
in order to take the Carnival deal.
Right.
So they made a decision to chase this deal on a cruise ship, knowing that they're not going to supply some of their distributors in other states.
But so choose wisely. You know, yeah, I think we heard the story. A lot of craft brewers right now. So again, 90% are under 7,500 barrels. 70% are under 1,000, and I'll pretty much guarantee most of those, if not 90%, can sell every drop they can brew, irrespective of beer loss. So, you know, if you look at that, you've got to figure out when do you play your hand and how do you play it, because those are beautiful brands, and they have an opportunity to introduce consumers to it, and then they've got to ask the question, where does it go? Can I afford the next step? Can I make the next step in terms of beer quality, in terms of resourcing, in terms of all those things?
So how do you guys make the decision, or how do brands make the decision to say, all right, I'm gonna make that next step. I'm gonna invest. I'm gonna go, you know, take out bank debt. I'm gonna go sign a new investor to.
Yeah, it comes down to knowing your business model and not getting too far ahead of yourself. So, you know, I think there's a lot of brands that have done this exceedingly well. And, you know, you think about it, if you believe what we believe about occasions, you know, somebody comes in here and drinks a killer IPA, and then 2 weeks later wants to share that experience with their friends that go to a party.
How are they going to get it?
So chances are they might not drive all the way out to Milwaukee or out to Deacom to get another one of those. They might go to the Safeway they were at. And they're going to know IPA, and then they might want local, right? But you think about the journey consumers go on, and again, you heard the numbers. Still, 9 out of 10 beers consumed in the United States are not craft beers. And we think there's a bubble. 9 out of 10. And all of you folks are, you know, everybody loves to throw terms around and cliches, and, you know, I always say I think craft beer is a movement, right? I don't say that because I'm going to get out there and postulatize and, you know, say, you know, everything's great. But all of us introduce consumers to better beers and to more complex beers and to different styles. But we have to accept that for the majority of those consumers, most of whom don't live in places like Portland where they have the access to it, are still going to go to Safeway. They're still going to go to Publix. They're still going to go to Stop and Shop or Hannaford or any of those accounts. And
They're going to buy a beer.
the key is, how do you take these 75 or these 90% of brewers that are under 7,500 barrels, all of which is draft, all of which is locally distributed, and start to play in the bigger leagues, where right now, candidly, it's dominated by, you know, AB, Miller Coors, Heineken, Crown, and then you've got Boston New Belgium, Sierra,
You,
us to an extent. And that to me is the game.
Lagunitas.
Yeah, Lagunitas. You know, Lagunitas growing like a weed right now, no pun intended. But exactly, I'm in Oregon, it's okay. But those are the brands that I think, you know, you think about it. I said Lagunitas, everybody knew it, right? That's a brand. You can say New Belgium, that's a brand.
Right.
It's not, people aren't buying it because they happened to be there and it was local. They were there, they saw it, they experienced it, and that grew without. So I think, again, I go back to, hey, remember why you got into the business for a lot of brewers. Never lose sight of that in terms of the brand that you want to create, the beer you want to brew, and always be proud of what's on the label, right? Always be proud of what's inside the bottle. Then worry about what you see after it and be really careful because the China math is easy to do. But I'll guarantee you the complexity you'll introduce into your organizations with respect to the number of people you have to hire, the talent you need, the supply chain complexities, how much you concern yourself about being able to make whatever capital servicing payments they are, be it to a private investor, your uncle, to your shareholders, to a bank, you know, or something that everybody should just not shy away from, but know what you're getting into.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the importance of two things that are kind of a paradox, which is don't get ahead of yourself, but also emphasizing the importance of forecasting.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you kind of balance that? How do you look into the future while not getting lost there?
A very wise business school professor once told me, the most sophisticated models known to mankind are those used to predict the weather. And I always remember that when people say they're going to get better at forecasting, okay? So for those of us who woke up yesterday morning in Portland, the forecast did not call for what we had in Portland yesterday. Yet that's what the most sophisticated forecasts said was going to happen. So I'm a big believer, put enough effort into forecasting, but beyond that, just worry about making sure your supply chain, again, is capable of buffering all that uncertainty, right? So you don't know, it's like when you have a party and you invited 50 friends and you don't know whether 30 are gonna show up or those 50 are gonna bring another 30 with them and they're gonna be 80 people. So we all do it in our life, right? We balance how much food do I need, how much beer do I have, if I have to start like kind of skimping, where do I go to my back stock, what happens there? For me, the beer business in general, regardless of who you are, big or small, is a lot like that. Like, don't worry, I would argue.
It's like your pantry.
It's like your pantry. Don't worry too much about your forecast accuracy. And it drives our friends, our wholesalers crazy, like our friends here at Melitus. But that's why we always say, hey, make sure you carry significant inventory because we don't know what's going to happen. And that'll level out, right? But if you're inviting 50 people over and you don't know if it's going to be 30 or 80, you want to make sure that you don't have so much that if only 30 come, you're throwing food out.
Yep.
And you want to make sure that if 80 come over, you're not that guy that threw a bad party, right?
Interesting.
So,
Final question, Dave.
All right.
Because I'm melting up here, by
And
the way.
I need a damn beer.
Okay. Kind of.
Oh my God.
Kind of.
Where did that come from?
Shifting gears. Your big
Who
thing
brought this
is
over?
gross margins, Andy. So, do smaller craft brewers understand how important a piece of the business is as they scale?
So we're publicly traded, and I've been on a gross margin kick since the beginning of the year. And it goes back to what I believe is really important for a business. Gross margin is the heart of your business. So gross margin isn't what you drop to the bottom line. Gross margin just says, fundamentally, my business can produce this for this much, right? I can brew this killer beer for X, and I can sell it for Y.
Yep.
And then the difference between that is what do I have left? And then I can make really interesting decisions. I can either invest that in people, I can invest it in market expansion so that I can not get ahead of myself, but I can actually put sales reps in a market and then expand and make more gross margin. I can dividend it out to my shareholders. I can use it to fund increased investment. I can use it to actually do a few one-offs, to Brady's point, and say, you know what, Widmer Brothers is worthy of having some killer beers in the 30 for 30 series, and we don't necessarily have to worry as much for every one of those beers about the gross margin because we can cross-subsidize it from other beers, right? So I think gross margin is something that people don't really appreciate enough in terms of really being fundamental to you being able to have a sustainable business. It doesn't mean you're mercenary. It doesn't mean you're a bad person, right? Irrespective of what you feel about capitalism or not, gross margin is just, hey, I get $5 or $3 or $2 left. I get to decide, am I going to reinvest that in my business? Am I going to reinvest it in my brand? Am I going to spend it and am I going to give it back to my investor? Or am I going to give it back to my aunt who's funded these tanks that I'm expanding on? So, you know, I think for a lot of people, when you're brewing and selling everything you can, life is good. And you think it's always going to be that way.
It's not.
But when you expand to that second market where you're not local and where you don't see the bartender every night and you can't afford to put a sales rep there and your wholesaler loves you until he brings the next beer brand in, then gross margin all of a sudden starts to become like, oh my God, why didn't I worry about this before?
And it costs more to get there.
Yeah, it totally costs
So you
more.
make less.
Right, you know, exactly.
Yeah.
Andy and Chris.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks, guys. So, one final note. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Chris.
I've heard many people refer to you as the smartest guy in the beer business right now. So we are honored to have you here.
Thank you. Now he's pandering, by the way.
Please come hang out with us more at our conference. No, so we do this. We mentioned it a couple times. Andy spoke at it before. We do this for a full day. All kinds of conversations like this about marketing, branding, finance. I mean, you name it. Sort of all the nuts and bolts of running a successful craft brewery business these days. And you know, with all the challenges that are out there, the importance on branding, the importance on all these decision-making things that we talked about. I mean, it's becoming much more critical. So we do this every twice a year, once in San Diego, once on the East Coast. Our next one's coming up in December in San Diego. Come hang out with us there. Come have some beers, and hopefully we see you in San Diego. Cheers.
Cheers.